The Geneva Protocol, signed by 132 nations on the 17th of June, 1925, was a treaty established to ban the use of chemical and biological weapons during wartime. As stated by Coupland and Lines, it was fostered in part by a 1918 appeal in which the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, described the use of poisonous gas against soldiers as a barbarous invention which science is bringing to perfection. 65. The protocol required that all remaining stockpiles of chemical weapons be destroyed. Chemical warfare agents that contained bromine, nitroaromatic, and chlorine were dismantled and destroyed. 66. The destruction and disposal of the chemicals did not consider the long-term and adverse impacts on the environment. Alt-Houthi Geneva Protocol banned the use of chemical weapons during wartime. The protocol did not ban the production of chemical weapons. 67. In fact, since the Geneva Protocol, the stockpiling of chemical weapons has continued, and weapons have become more lethal. As a result, the Chemical Weapons Canister and Stockpile. 64. Convention, CWC, was drafted in 1993, which prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. Despite there being an international ban on chemical warfare, the CWC allows domestic law enforcement agencies of signing countries to use chemical weapons on their citizens. 68. Effect on World War II. All major combatants stockpiled chemical weapons during the Second World War, but the only reports of its use in the conflict were the Japanese use of relatively small amounts of mustard gas and Luizit in China. 69. 70. Italy's use of gas in Ethiopia, in what is more often considered to be the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and very rare occurrences in Europe. For example, some mustard gas bombs were dropped on Warsaw on the 3rd of September, 1939, which Germany acknowledged in 1942 but indicated had been accidental. 59. Mustard gas was the agent of choice, with the British stockpiling 40,719 tons, the Soviets 77,400 tons, the Americans over 87,000 tons and the Germans 27,597 tons. 59. The destruction of an American cargo ship containing mustard gas led to many casualties in Bari, Italy, in December 1943. In both Axis and Allied nations, children in school were taught to wear gas masks in case of gas attack. Germany developed the poison gases Taban, Sarin, and Soman during the war, and used Zyklon B in Lyai termination camps. Neither Germany nor the Allied nations used any of their war gases in combat despite maintaining large stockpiles and occasional calls for their use. NB1. Poison gas played an important role in the Holocaust. Britain made plans to use mustard gas on the landing beaches in the event of an invasion of the United Kingdom in 1940. 71. 72. The United States considered using gas to support their planned invasion of Japan. 73. Casualties. John Singer Sargent's 1918 painting Gas. The contribution of gas weapons to the total casualty figures was relatively minor. British figures, which were accurately maintained from 1916, recorded that 3% of gas casualties were fatal, 2% were permanently invalid and 70% were fit for duty again within 6 weeks. 74. It was remarked as a joke that if someone inhaled gas, everyone in France would put in a mask. Gas shock was as frequent as shell shock. H. Allen, Towards the Flame, 1934. Gas. Gas. Quick, boys. An ecstasy of fumbling fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim. Through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams. Before my helpless sight he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Wilfred Owen, Dulcet Decorumist, 1917 Plate 3, pallid type of asphyxia from phosgenic poisoning, with circulatorophilia, American Red Cross and Medical Research Committee, an atlas of gas poisoning, 1918 Death by gas was often slow and painful. According to Dennis Winter, Death's Men, 1978, a fatal dose of phosgene eventually led to shallow breathing and retching, pulse up to 120, an ashen face and the discharge of foul pints, 2 liters, of yellow liquid from the lungs each hour for the 48 off drowning spasms. A common fate of those exposed to gas was blindness, chlorine gas or mustard gas being the main causes. One of the most famous First World War paintings, gassed by John Singer Sargent, captures such a scene of mustard gas casualties which he witnessed at a dressing station at Le Bac du Sud near Arras in July 1918. The gases used during that battle, tear gas, caused temporary blindness and / or a painful stinging in the eyes. These ear bandages were normally water-soaked to provide a rudimentary form of pain relief to the eyes of casualties before they reached more organized medical help. The proportion of mustard gas fatalities to total casualties was low. 2% of mustard gas casualties died and many of these succumbed to secondary infections rather than the gas itself. Once it was introduced at the 3rd Battery of Ypres, mustard gas produced 90% of all British gas casualties and 14% of battle casualties of any type. Estimated gas casualties, 46, nation fatal total. Fatal and non-fatal, Russia 56,000,419,340, Germany 9,000,200,000,000, France 8,000,190,000, British Empire, includes Canada, 8,109,188,706, Austria-Hungary 3,000,100,000, United States 1,46272,807, Italy 4,62760,000, others 1,000,100,000. Mustard gas was a source of extreme dread. In The Anatomy of Courage, 1945, Lord Moran, who had been a medical officer during the war, wrote after July 1917 gas partly usurped the role of high explosive in bringing to head a natural unfitness for war. The gassed men were an expression of trench fatigue, a menace when manhood of the nation had been picked over. 75. Mustard gas did not need to be inhaled to be effective. Any contact with skin was sufficient. Exposure to 0.1 kg was enough to cause massive blisters. Higher concentrations could burn flesh to the bone. It was particularly effective against the soft skin of the eyes, nose, armpits and groin, since it dissolved in the natural moisture of those areas. Typical exposure would result in swelling of the conjunctiva and eyelids, forcing them closed and rendering the victim temporarily blind. Where it contacted the skin, moist red patches would immediately appear which after 24 hours would have formed into blisters. Other symptoms included severe headache, elevated pulse and temperature, fever, and pneumonia, from blistering in the lungs. Many of those who survived a gas attack were scarred for life. Respiratory disease and failing eyesight were common post-war afflictions. Of the Canadians who, without any effective protection, had withstood first chlorine attacks during Second Ypres, 60% of the casualties had to be repatriated and half of these were still unfit by the end of the war. Over 3 years later, many of those who were fairly soon recorded as fit for service were left with scar tissue in their lungs. This tissue was susceptible to tuberculosis attack. It was from this that many of the 1918 casualties died, around the time of the Second World War, shortly before sulfur drugs became widely available for its treatment. British testimony. British Forces gas casualties on the Western Front. Date Agent casualties, official. Fate Annan Fatal April May 1915 Chlorine 3507,000 May 1915 June 1916 Lacrimance 00 December 1915 August 1916 Chlorine 1,0134,207 July 1916 July 1917 Various 5328,806 July 1917 November 1918 Mustard gas 4,086160,526 April 1915 November 1918 Total 5,981180,539 A British nurse treating mustard gas cases recorded they cannot be bandaged or touched. We covered them with a tent of propped up sheets. Gas burns must be agonizing because usually the other cases do not complain even with the worst wounds, but gas cases are invariably beyond endurance and they cannot help crying out. 76. A post-mortem account from the British official medical history records one of the British casualties case for aged 39 years. Gassed the 29th of July 1917. Admitted to casualty clearing station the same day. Died about 10 days later. Brownish pigmentation present over large surfaces of the body. A white ring of skin where the wristwatch was. Marked superficial burning of the face and scrotum. The larynx much congested. The whole of the trachea was covered by a yellow membrane. The bronchi contained abundant gas. The lungs fairly voluminous. The right lung showing extensive collapse at the base. Liver congested and fatty. Stomach showed numerous submucous hemorrhages. The brain substance was unduly wet and very congested. 77. Civilian casualties. The distribution of gas cloud casualties was not limited to the front. Nearby towns were at risk from winds blowing the poison gases through. Civilians rarely had a warning system to alert their neighbors of feed hunger and often did not have access to effective gas masks. When the gas came to the towns, it could easily jet into houses through open windows and doors. An estimated 100,000 to 260,000 civilian casualties were caused by chemical weapons during the conflict, and tens of thousands, along with military personnel, died from scarring of the lungs, skin damage, and cerebral damage in the years after the conflict ended. Many commanders on both sides knew that such weapons would cause major harm to civilians, as wind would blow poison gases into nearby civilian towns, but nonetheless continued to use them throughout the war. British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig wrote in his diary, "My officers and I were aware that such weapon would cause harm to women and children living in nearby towns, as strong winds were common on the battlefront. However, because the weapon was to be directed against the enemy, none of us were overly concerned at all." 78, 79, 80, 81. Countermeasures. None of the First World War's combatants were prepared for the introduction of poison gas as a weapon. Once gas was introduced, development of gas protection began, and the process continued for much of the year, producing a series of increasingly effective gas masks. 51. Even at Second Ypres, Germany, still unsure of the weapon's effectiveness, only issued breathing masks. Top engineers handling the gas. At Ypres, a Canadian medical officer, who was also a chemist, quickly identified the gas as chlorine and recommended that the troops urinate on a cloth and hold it over their mouth and nose. Urine would be left to sit for a period so that the ammonia would activate. The engineers handling the gas. At Ypres, a Canadian medical officer, who was also a chemist, quickly. The small box respirator featured a single piece, close-fitting rubberized mask with eyepieces. The box filter was compact and could be worn around the neck. The SBR could be readily upgraded as more effective filter technology was developed. The British-designed SBR was also adopted for use by the American Expeditionary Force. The SBR was the prized possession of the ordinary infantryman. When the British were forced to retreat during the German Spring Offensive of 1918, it was found that while some troops had discarded their rifles, hardly any had left behind their respirators. Horses and mules were important methods of transport that could be